Hello, my name is Katie. I am an academic coach with SASS, the Student Academic Support Services. Today I'm going to go over the Study Smarter, Not Harder series. And yeah, let's go ahead and jump right in. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our department, again, we're Student Academic Support Services. That includes the Learning Center, which is essentially a lot of the STEM tutoring that is offered on campus. It also includes academic coaching, which is what I do, as well as the Roads to Success presentations that you're in right now. We also have the student learning initiatives, which is various entities on campus. And then finally, we have academic testing services. So if you have accommodations through the DRC, I would highly recommend connecting with them. But if you are interested in accommodations, we highly recommend going through the DRC specifically. Perfect. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. And first, what I want to do is just talk about what is studying. A lot of students have this perception that studying is quite static. It can be a slog. It can be cumbersome. But by shifting our views and our strategies, we can make it much more engaging. And we can certainly study smarter, which is what we'll go over. And when we do that, look, now we can smile as a student as we're studying. Very exciting. So what does it actually mean to study smarter? So that includes this like deeper engagement. So using active study strategies, which we'll talk about shortly, to help us transition this information that we have gathered into knowledge, essentially helps us deepen our understanding and connections. We have increased memory retention. So essentially that includes like well-timed recall and retrieval practice. Essentially with the goal of lessening the amount of times you need to reread or revisit the reference material. And then also this ongoing cycle, we can create a repeatable structure. And structure gives us something to lean on when we aren't feeling as motivated. Ideally, we want to find what works best for you and your learning, and kind of meet that middle ground between your learning and also like what fits for this class for this term. We're going to offer a lot of different study options to choose from. So yours may not look like this person sitting next to you, and that is totally fine. So the first thing that I mentioned was this active studying, this deeper engagement. So we're going to go over what is active and passive studying. So first we want to talk about the difference between information and knowledge. So information is kind of the collection of various data points, right? Kind of like what's depicted here, this like smattering of different information. Whereas like knowledge and deeper understanding come from making connections between those pieces of information. Another way of thinking this is on the left, generally kind of depicts someone who's more of a novice in a topic or subject, whereas the right depicts someone who's kind of approaching mastery of that subject matter. We're going to relate to this in active and passive study strategies. Passive study strategies help us collect information, absolutely, but active strategies help us make connections for a better grasp of the topic in general. So when we're talking about active and passive studying, for passive specifically, it's generally input focused. It's also helps us build familiarity, like I mentioned, and then it helps us engage in the moment. And it does require a decent amount of attention. That compared to active studying, where active studying is very output focused. It solidifies understanding. It emphasizes preparation, participation, and review. And it also requires more critical thinking. And we'll go, both are particularly necessary. What we find in coaching is that many students rely a little too heavily on passive studying, which is necessary. But when we do that, it kind of leads to just frustration. We're not remembering the information as long, and it's not reflecting in the grades that we want. So when I say that active and passive are output and input, this is kind of the examples of what I'm talking about. So for active, we're talking about engaging with others. We're putting things in our own words. We're creating our own visuals. We're engaging in like self-quizzing and practice tests. And passive is mostly that input, right? I'm taking this information in. I'm listening to lecture. I'm reading the notes. We're taking that information in and holding it. Whereas an active, we're essentially grabbing that information, retrieving it, recalling it, and putting it back out into the world. And a quick note about flashcards. They are a phenomenal bridge from passive to active studying, but I always recommend that my students essentially like diversify the way that they're studying. Flashcards, unfortunately, because you have immediate access to the reference information, can sometimes give us a false sense of confidence. So we really want to vary it up. They're a phenomenal way to like get your way through like a lot of jargon and things, but we always want to kind of pair it with other things. For instance, like we really want to make sure we're practicing in the modality that we're going to be judged. And what that means is if I have an exam with multiple choice questions and short answer questions coming up, I should practice that essentially prior to the exam, right? That's like practicing in the way I will be judged. Like I have essays coming up, I should really be utilizing like the writing center and other resources to help me brush up on my writing, things like that. So here's an example of essentially what this would look like for reading assignments. And I'm going to go ahead and relate these to like, what would this, why do these count as active studying? So we talked about that, the preparation, the participation, the review piece. So for active studying, we're preparing, we're changing those headings to questions. We're getting a little bit of an idea of what it is we need to be looking for. We're participating, we're summarizing each section as you read. We're reviewing, we're quizzing classmates on the information that we read. We're engaging in critical thinking. So that discussion between classmates and creating a concept map from the material are great ways to kind of involve deeper thinking of the material. And then finally, most of this is output based, particularly active studying section, right? So we're summarizing and answering in our own questions. We're creating concepts maps. We're engaging with classmates, things like that. So that's an example of what we would go over. And so essentially what we're wanting to do is take an idea of what are the kinds of things that you're engaging with on your classes. We want to make sure that we're doing it in that repeatable way that we mentioned earlier. So this is what we're talking about when we're making a study cycle specifically. And now that we've established what active and passive studying are, we can go over the ways and how we want to utilize these strategies. And one thing I really want to help pay attention to is like, why are we using the term cycle? We want to talk about this as a process. It essentially brings the concept of your need for consistency as a student and also the structure for you that you need, essentially like this consistent exposure you need that really leads to long-term memory retention. When I'm talking about those repeating, like that repeat exposure, I think that this is a phenomenal visual for what I'm talking about. So this is the typical forgetting curve. So on the y-axis, we have percent of retention. So this is essentially like, okay, just walked out of lecture, just read the book, that kind of piece. And then on the x-axis, we have just days that are passed. And so on the y-axis, we have, we see that within the first day, we're dropping retention about 20%. And then come on 3 days, we are dropping about 40%. And so what we want to do is we want to essentially like interrupt this and bring us back up to 100%. And so when we do something like a review session within the first day, not only does it pop up to back to 100%, it also lessens the intensity of these curves, right? So we're getting less and less steep each time we're reviewing, which means that the information is getting set into long-term memory retention. The goal is ultimately when we're interfacing with like exams or essays later in the term, we're requiring less relearning and rereading when we're doing so. So how do we essentially marry those two things between, okay, so I have this active and passive study strategies, and then I have this idea where I really want to repeat and make sure that I'm touching on this information more than once, right? So that's why we talk about this as a cycle. And so some things, the different components of the cycle include essentially preview, attend, review, study, and assess. And these are all things that we'll cover a little bit more in depth. But this offers a template for learning that promotes greater retention. And the goal is to give direction for a learning process with concrete steps and timing. So the first one that we're going to go over is preview. So essentially, we're engaging with that material that you need to, right? This is the first pass at the information. That could be a textbook, that could be reading articles, right? We really want to take notes of any questions that we have from this reading, questions that remain unanswered. We really want to make sure that we're preparing for class and bringing those with us. Next is actually attending class. And something that I always recommend to students is kind of choosing between or doing both a pre-brief or debrief of class. So that can look like 5 to 10 minutes before lecture to touch on the main points and kind of review the questions that you have. For debrief, it's checking to see were all of your questions answered, and does this prompt like a visit to office hours or something. Also an opportunity to like synthesize your notes from lecture and reading. And ultimately, we do want to take notes of some sort during lecture, but honestly, that can look so different for each student. And finding the strategy for that that makes the most sense for you is part of the journey. Next, we have review. So by this one, we're kind of emphasizing this 24-hour period after you've attended class, right? So this can be really great because we're letting that information sink in overnight. Quick plug here, sleep is really important. It helps us learn. But we're kind of going away from this and we're saying, like, what is still unclear? And that kind of prompts this, okay, so I really do need to engage. I need to go to office hours, make sure that I'm going to that study group, interacting with TAs or LAs, or tutors, the writing center, whatever makes the most sense for you. Why do we do this? Returning to the content kind of interrupts that forgetting curve, right? That forgetting. Essentially, we're bringing our attention back up and hopefully solidifying that curve a little bit more. This is also our opportunity to switch to primarily active studying. Those first two, preview and attend, while they do have active components, they are generally more passive in nature, and that's completely fine. You do need to get the information into your brain in order to put it back out there, right? But this is a great, essentially, like time to say that now that I've gone over this information 3 times, we want to switch to primarily active study strategies. Specifically for studying, so right, what I mentioned before, we want to recreate the ways that we're going to be assessed. So if you're getting tested in one which way, we want to make sure that that's included in our study strategies when we're preparing. We really want to engage with others. We want to solidify our understanding through our own words and visuals. Also, heavily important, we need to be folding in past week's material into our study sessions. Think about that the typical forgetting curve, right? We still want to make sure we're touching on information from week 1, 2, and 3 as we hit week 4 and 5. So that way we're not missing any information, or essentially we're no longer needing to cram for exams and kind of leaving essays to the last point because we've been preparing all of this time all term. And finally, we have assess. So something that I really want to push here is that this is something that you're going to need a little bit of trial and error on. This is something that definitely the first 2 weeks of term, you're finding your groove, you're seeing what makes sense for you and the specific class. But essentially, like those past exams, papers, projects, they're assessment tools, but they're also learning tools for you. So it's something you want to go and check on and kind of get an idea of where you are in your courses, and bring those questions to your professors, to your tutors, to your peers, right? This is also an opportunity to revisit your study cycle. what's working, what isn't. Also a great time to meet with an academic coach. Shameless plug here, absolutely. But ultimately for this, we're trying to make sure that the study cycle is serving both you as a learner and also the structure that's in your current course. So we're going to go over a couple different options and just like examples. So this student specifically is a STEM student. So this is the way in which they are going over this. So for this preview, they're looking at topics and things before class and bringing in any questions. When they're in class, they're taking notes, and then they prefer a debrief. So they're trying to consolidate their notes, but also have any note any questions that were answered. And then for their kind of review period, they're filling in the gaps from those from the lecture and reading notes. They're attending office hours and the tutors to get those questions answered. And they're also making that switch to that active studying. And so for them, that looks like creating that reference sheet with definitions and formulas. They're engaging in assigned and supplemental practice problems. They're trying to teach their friends the concepts they're learning in class. And they're also attending review sessions. And then finally, for their assessment, they're going through past materials for the week. Are they feeling prepared for the exam given how they've been doing on the quizzes? How did, how did those past exams, how did those past quizzes go? Are the methods working? And they're going to an academic coach or tutoring for things to help them with this process. Next is someone who's in the humanities. So for them specifically, they're using their discussion post questions to guide their reading and bring any additional questions into class. They're choosing to do a pre-brief for class just to go over the topics and the questions that they want to answer. And then they're taking notes in class, and then they're reviewing. So they're rewording lecture notes into their own words, and then they're bringing any questions they have to office hours. And this is kind of, okay, so I'm trying to get this information in before I make that big switch to like purely active studying. And active studying for this particular student looks like going to weekly study groups to discuss material from current and past weeks. We're creating a concept map of connected material and also collecting material related to the assigned essay topic, right? They're doing that throughout the term. And then for assessment, do they feel prepared for that essay, that project they're looking forward to? How did the past essay projects go, right? Are the methods working? And they can go to an academic coach or the writing center for additional support. And so hopefully these give you an idea of what the study cycle can look like for different students. But know that if you ever want to talk a little bit more in depth about this, we are absolutely happy to see you in coaching. Yeah, more than happy to meet. We do other topics as well, like self-management, which is time management, and if you're struggling with motivation. But yeah, we would love to have you, and we look forward to seeing you soon.